Wow, my mere presence has never quieted down a crowd as today, so I know this has nothing to do with me. Maybe it was a suit. You guys are not used to a suit. Michael, remind me to wear a suit all the time. Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, well, thank you so much for being here. We have a special guest for you tonight, this afternoon. I'm really thankful to the Jack Miller Center for the support of this session. And of course, our special guest, Peter Thiel, who needs really no introduction. Yeah, you have heard about his success. You have heard about what he stands for. And we're going to spend a little bit of time hearing from him on this. And of course, this is all brought to us because of Professor Stuart Warner, 27-year professor at Roosevelt University. And without Stuart's support and co-chairing our American Dream Conference, this session would not have happened. So thank you so much, Stuart. I will mention the American Dream partly because all of our discussion is about reconsidering the American Dream. There is no perfection in that phrase. We always have to reconsider it, leave it hopefully in a better shape for the next generation. And as somebody mentioned, I think Juan Castro recently mentioned, that the American Dream is not a marathon, is not a sprint, is actually a relay race. Okay? And I like that analogy because we pass on the baton to the next member of our family and the next member of our community to carry on what has happened previous to us and during our time. I also want to mention to you the words, in 1931, James Truslow Adams formally defined the American Dream. What he said, I quote, remember this was in the middle of the Depression, "A dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are capable, regardless of the circumstances of birth or position." Okay. With that said, Stuart, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome Peter Thiel to Roosevelt University. Pete is an entrepreneur, an investor, a founder. Of all these things, I've had nothing whatsoever to do with him. I know Peter as a man of ideas. I first met him in Claremont, California, at a conference on the 10th century Arabic philosopher Al-Farabi. I next met him at MIT at a conference on the mastery of nature, where he gave a lecture on the subject of immortality, a subject in which I was very much interested in. We brought Peter here today as a man of ideas, and he's given a great deal of thought to a wide swath of them, but at least at the outset, we're going to be focusing on three concepts on which Peter has given a great deal of thought, which he's spoken on and which he's written on. And this is globalization, technology, and progress. So I'd like to begin by talking about globalization. This is a term that shows up in English in the 1930s. It's taken over from a new French word in the 1920s. And it means something like psychology for the education of the young. It's to introduce the child into the world. It seems in the last 20 years to mean something very much other than that. Like many such terms, it's open to the vagaries of time. It seems a little bit slippery and opaque, but it's clearly an important notion. So, by your lights, when we're talking about globalization, what do we mean by it, and where do we stand with respect to globalization in the world today?
Well, let me maybe, there are all sorts of different ways to define them, and I think you're quite right that all of these terms, including technology and certainly progress, are quite slippery in their own ways. But let me offer sort of my account of globalization, and I always like to contrast it with science or technology. And I think that progress in the world in which we live, the world of the years past the Enlightenment, the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, takes the form of globalization or technology. And I define globalization as copying things that work. And so it is sort of the spread of knowledge. It is, and sort of, you can think of it as horizontal progress. We have something that works, and then you copy it elsewhere. And then science or technology is new knowledge. And so I draw that on a y-axis. So you draw globalization on an x-axis, technology on a y-axis. It's doing new things. And so, so I think progress involves some combination of inventing new things, and then once you've invented the new things, having those things spread throughout the world. And then the mechanisms for globalization, for how this copying, how this spread of knowledge, of ideas, of inventions takes place, it happens through the movement of people. So that's debates about immigration. It happens about the movement of goods. So that's trade. It happens through the movement of money, which is capital and banking, and maybe also communications, which again has a technological component in the form of the internet today. And so there are. I think you can look at it in terms of these four specific vectors: people, immigration, trade, finance, and the internet. But it's all within this larger framework of copying things that work. Now, if we sort of, now my claim is that progress involves these things advancing in our society, but I want to be very clear that I'm not simply utopian about these things. And there are forms of technology that can be bad. There are forms of globalization that can be bad. And so you could have technology, it's, I think, our intuitions on this are a little bit more straightforward because the Hollywood movies all show us technology that doesn't work. And so it's nuclear weapons might be a bad invention that didn't really represent progress for the world. There are people who would say that fossil fuels, or there's certain types of technologies that are more environmentally destructive. They do more harm than good. And so you can have debates about a lot of different areas of technology, whether they are really net benefits for humanity at all. And then with respect to globalization, there are certainly forms of it that can be quite problematic. And so you have questions whether it leads to sort of a homogenization of the world that makes it sort of the same in a boring and sterile way. It's intellectually bad. There's always a worry that globalization would lead to a one-world state that might be very tyrannical. And of course, with a lot of the debates we have right now, there's always a question whether the free movement of people also means the easy movement of terrorism and sort of people that we might not want to have move quite so easily from place to place. And so, so even though I would say there's no good future without technology and without globalization, we should not be sort of sanguine and simply say that these things are unreflectively good, because globalization can take problematic forms. And what I think is going on, like right now in our world in the year 2016, to sort of telescope it to the immediate, is there is some sort of crisis of the globalization project that's going on, where it had been going at a ferocious breakneck pace for a number of decades, and it has hit some sort of a crisis where people are asking some questions about how well it's really working. And even though there's no alternative to it, you can only continue with more globalization, it's not quite delivering the goods. And there's certainly questions about distribution of goods. Does globalization just benefit the 1%? Does it, there are questions about, and there are questions about, maybe it enables corruption in ways that would never have been possible before. So if you're a dictator in a third world country, you can now move all your money to a Swiss bank account, so you can be sort of a much more corrupt dictator than you could have ever been in a world without globalization.
All right. So there's this economist we've both read and both know, Tyler Cowen, who published this book 13 years ago called Creative Destruction. And he takes up this question of the relationship of globalization and the homogenization of culture. And he argues against this, that if anything, cultures are made more diverse, more pluralistic. The more globalization there is, the more diversity in culture, and he makes an argument that this is a good thing, right? You were to Japan not that long ago, and you notice things about the Japanese culture with respect to the United States and imitating the West. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, certainly, I'm not even sure. I'd be surprised if even Tyler still believes what he wrote 13 years ago on this. But certainly, Japan for many years was the absolute poster child for this globalization. It was starting with the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, where Japan copied at a breakneck pace the West. It was one of the countries that they actually caught up within a few decades to Western Europe, the United States, and then again, it's sort of after World War II. There was again this sort of breakneck copying where they copied cheap toys, cheap cars. It was treated as a joke by the U.S. for quite a while. But by the 1970s and 1980s, Japan had become this incredibly fearsome competitor. Right. And this is parenthetically one of the things that's a little bit tricky, I think, in the globalization dynamic, because when you copy things that work, you're often creating much more intense competition. And so that's always an aspect of it that's quite tricky. So even though Japan copying the United States was quite flattering, after 30, 40 years, they had copied us so well that they were, wiping out the car industry in the U.S. and all sorts of other sectors of our economy were under a lot more pressure because they, in a sense, copied us almost too well. Now, I think that if you go to Japan today, and I was in it for just a little over a week, but and I'd been there once before in 2000. I think the change over the last 15 years or so is it's a move away from globalization. They're much less interested in the United States. Fewer people are studying English. They're not even playing golf anymore. In the 1980s, golf was the rage. The golf courses are being turned into solar panel farms, but no one really wants to play golf anymore. There's still some interest in information technology, my industry, so they were interested in that part. But I think it is actually much less imitative, and it is no longer the Japan of the 1870s, or even the Japan of the 50s and 60s, or even of the golf courses of the 1980s. They are no longer interested in us, and so I think that's a striking move away from globalization in Japan that's happened, and I'm of course always much more interested in what this means about America than about Japan, and I think it's a disturbing. It should push us to ask some disturbing questions about America. Is our society less worthy of being emulated than it was in the past? Is Japan right that there isn't that much that it should copy, that there is not much left to learn from us? And so I think it should push us to ask some very tough questions in that direction.
My experience with this was in used bookstores. In the early 1980s, I would go into bookstores, there would be whole rows of books, especially on the European Enlightenment, and especially the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith and David Hume. The Japanese dealers would come in and buy thousands of books wholesale and ship them back. And a lot of the important books on the Scottish Enlightenment were written by Japanese scholars in the 80s. And all of a sudden, that has come to an end. And they no longer have an interest in that.
That's very interesting. No, I think there's something very striking. And Japan is, it's just one country, but it's interesting because Japan was the most extreme on copying. And it was doing it so incredibly well for over 100 years. And the fact that they have stopped altogether, maybe something's gone badly wrong in Japan, but I think the critical question we should ask is, has something gone badly wrong in our society where it's no longer one that is producing as many new things that are worthy of being emulated?
Let me push this a little bit more. At the very same time that all these books were being purchased, There were articles in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that Japan was going to become the world's economic engine, that America was falling down, it would surpass America, look how much we have to be worried about. That doesn't seem to have been exactly right. Now the same concerns are being asked about China and India. Are these going to be the economic powers of the future? And is America going to fall down with respect to them?
Well, this is very speculative, very hard to answer these sorts of questions. There's a degree to which there's certainly one difference is China and India are much bigger than Japan, and so one way you could describe the dynamic was Japan sort of caught up to the U.S. There was not, at the end of the day, that much innovation that took place in Japan once they had caught up, and so they never really overtook us. And then it was just a country that was, maybe a third to 40% of the population of the United States, and it would never become a country with a larger GDP or anything like that. Now, you look at a country like China; it has 4 times the U.S. population, and so if China simply copies everything in the U.S., and if it were to catch up to the U.S., you might have a country that has a GDP 3 to 4 times that of the United States. It might not surpass the U.S. on a per capita basis, but geopolitically, that would be a much more important event where maybe the most important country in the world is the one with the largest GDP. Now, the way the U.S. Historically, or the Western world historically had stayed ahead was by advancing technology much more quickly. So if China's copying, but we're continually doing new things, then we would be able to stay ahead of India and China from a GDP perspective for a much longer period of time. But then that gets to the question of how healthy the state of technological progress is as well. So, but I think there's something a little bit different about China and India because they're simply on such a bigger scale.
Right. So in the same time frame in the 1980s, the idiomatic expressions were the third world, the second world, the first world. This seems to have been transformed into the developing and the developed.
Yes.
So it sounds as if this has to be connected to this copying or imitative quality that is, I think, for you at the heart of what globalization is.
Yes. Well, let's. I always think there's this contrast between globalization and technology, and so if we go back the last 200 years, longer sweep of history, there have been periods of globalization and periods of technology, but they don't precisely overlap. Mm-hmm. And I always think of the 19th century as this period when we had both, especially after the Napoleonic Wars ended, 1815 to 1914. You had 100 years of tremendous globalization, tremendous technological progress, and they sort of both advanced in parallel. World War I starts 1914, globalization goes in reverse, the world starts to break up into discrete pieces. It becomes a less peaceful world. There's less trade, less of all these kinds of things that takes place. But there still is tremendous technological progress. And then I would date 1971 as the year when globalization restarts. That's the year Kissinger goes to China. Mm-hmm. And then from 1971 onwards, we've had breakneck globalization for the last 45 years or so, mm-hmm. and I would argue actually somewhat more limited technological progress, mostly in software and computers, and not so much in the world of atoms. But so the 20th century.
Can you spell that out just a little bit?
Well, it's always hard to know exactly what's. So let's say a little bit about technology. Technology is doing new things, and so there's always a part of the definition of technology that's a little bit circular, that wherever you look at something new happening, that's technology. So in the 1920s, cars were technology. In the 1950s and 60s, jet airplanes were considered technology. Mm-hmm. And so if we define the word technology in 1966, 50 years ago, it would have been a wide range of things. It would have been computers, but it would have also been rockets and supersonic jets, and it would have been plans to, irrigate deserts and turn them into farmland, and it would have been new medicines, and it would have been all these different things. Whereas today, when you use the word technology, that's almost always synonymous with information technology, with computers, software, internet, mobile internet. And I think the sort of narrower definition of technology reflects the fact that we have sort of very rapid progress in this narrow set of areas, but much more limited progress in all these other areas. If you think of this from a career perspective, as a student, computer science has been the engineering field that was a good field to go into for the last 30 years, and that's because there was a lot happening there, whereas almost all other engineering fields were actually pretty bad decisions. If you were, I don't know, if you were a mechanical engineer, industrial engineer, chemical engineer, and say nothing of a nuclear engineer or aerospace engineer, these were sort of bad fields to go into. And so we've had sort of this narrow cone of progress around computers, and it's been more limited elsewhere. One way to express this geopolitically, coming back to your developed versus first and third world question, in the 1960s, when we had no globalization but lots of technology, you divided the world into first world and third world. And the first world was the part that was technologically progressing. The third world was this part that was just sort of completely busted and was never going to get fixed. And today, the developing countries are those parts that are copying the developed world. So this is a pro-globalization dichotomy, where the developed countries are being copied by the developing countries in this convergence theory of history as they're copying these things. But the developing-developed dichotomy also is an implicitly anti-technological dichotomy, because when we say that we live in the developed world, when we say that the United States, Western Europe, Japan are developed countries, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world where nothing new is going to happen, where all the inventions took place in the past, and where the younger generation should have reduced expectations for the future from those of their parents and grandparents. And so it's a pro-globalization but anti-technology dichotomy in a way. And I think it reflects the way in which the last 40 years have been an era of tremendous globalization and much more limited technology.
Let's take a midpoint between the 18th century and where we are now. Alexis de Tocqueville, great Frenchman, comes to America, writes this great book on democracy, probably the greatest book on democracy, Democracy in America. And after he gets back from America, he writes to a friend, and he says, this is what I wanted to write about, that there are these two sorts of regimes that organize the affairs of human beings. There's democracy and there's aristocracy. And I wanted to try to show that democracy was what he called, ironically, I think, a providential fact. Democracy, the recognition of the sovereignty of the individual, the dignity of the individual, the worth of the individual, had won out. And therefore, the world wasn't facing a choice between democracy and aristocracy. The choice was just with the form that democracy took. And democracy, like all forms of human organization, has its curses and its benefits, its costs and its blessings. You've spoken about globalization not being an unalloyed good. If you were going to list 1, 2, 3 of the great costs of globalization, what would they be? And Tocqueville goes on and says that if we're going to have just democracy, then the only way to deal with the costs are within the bowels of democracy itself, because there's no alternative to this. What are the costs of globalization? Are there the instruments within globalization to mitigate those costs?
Well, there certainly are a lot of different things one could point to. There's a strange question of governance. So you can ask, how well does democracy work if it gets to be too big a scale? And so if you have a democracy of a few million people, like the United States at the time of the Declaration of Independence, there's sort of, it's easier for there to be some say in that. If you have a democracy that's much, much larger, then this sort of is, every single person's vote counts for much less in a way. And people become more disconnected from the decisions. And so if you imagined a single world government with 7 billion people, and if you had a one world state, it might have democratic forms, but maybe there would be sort of a tremendous feeling of powerlessness and disconnection between things. And so maybe democracy often has its purest expressions when it's somewhat local in nature. And this is, and certainly a lot of the global institutions, a critique of them is that they're very undemocratic. So the European Union is, it has all sorts of benefits, but it's extremely unrepresentative of people, and Parliament's very weak, and most of it's actually these unelected bureaucracies that end up being super powerful. So that's certainly one dimension on which the globalization project has perhaps hit a wall. The one that I'd focus on more, though, let me take this, is if we go back to my globalization and technology quadrant, it's my view that the more important of the two is technology. If you had to pick one or the other, I'd always much rather have us coming up with new things and then maybe not disseminating them quite as quickly than simply disseminating things. And if all you have is globalization and no technological progress, then what happens is you get to a point, all the ideas have been copied, and then there's no more innovation. And maybe this is what's happened with Japan. That's why they're not interested in the US anymore. They copied everything there was to do. We're not innovating that much. And then in practice, there is a sort of trade-off between globalization and technology, because you have to choose which of these you're going to work on, which of these you're going to invest your time in. And if you want to sort of concretize this in an American context, I think of New York City as the center of globalization. And I think of Silicon Valley as the center of technology. And so in New York, finance is a naturally global industry because it's always easy to move money. It's easier to move money than goods or people. And so banking and finance tend to be extremely globalist in orientation. And so New York City is a place where you go if you're simply long globalization. And then Silicon Valley is a place that's more focused on inventing new things. And if you're a very talented person, you have a choice. Do you go to New York or do you go to Silicon Valley? And there's sort of a trade-off, which of these two you want to do. For a quarter century, from 1982 to 2007, the answer was clearly New York. That was the place you had to go. And then one way of interpreting the financial crisis of 2008 was that finance alone doesn't cut it, because you can't do that much new with just financial engineering and just the banks. And I'm not completely against the banks. I don't think the bankers should be shot, or that, the stock market should be shut down, or anything like that. I don't believe any of those things. But it is possible for a society to become over-financialized, where too many people believe that it's about the sort of globalized orientation and not enough about actually doing new things. And I think the sort of the silver lining to the crisis after 2008 is that perhaps there is an opening for a little bit of a reorientation of our society, a rebalancing to where it's a little bit less on the globalization side and a little bit more on the technology side. Now, it's not an absolute trade-off, but on an individual level, are you going to go to New York, or are you going to go to Silicon Valley?
I have a few questions to ask about technology on the basis of what you've said, but given that you've been talking about New York, a place I like very much, let me step back for just a second and ask a somewhat personal question about your own life with respect to New York. You go as an undergraduate to Stanford, and you chose wonderfully philosophy as a major. I like that. Good. We'll give you an opportunity to praise that in just a moment. And then you went to law school, also at Stanford. You clerk for a year, the 11th Circuit Court. And then you go to work as an attorney in New York City, and you walk out after 7 months, was it?
7 months and 3 days.
7 months and three. I apologize. Darn, this research never goes right. 7 months and 3 days. And then you go and you work for an investment bank?
Credit Suisse, but it was more on the trading side, yes.
On the trading side. But you left that. And then is there a connection between this great interest and passion you have with innovation and where you found yourself in New York?
And then moved back to Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
started
right.
PayPal and so on.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I was fully aware of these themes at this time. I'm always sort of very bad at this autobiographical stuff. But
I think there's something general here.
If I had to describe the way I was thinking about it when I was in high school and college, everything was hyper competitive, and you just had to, you had to figure out what everybody else was doing and do it even better than everybody else. So it was sort of this, and it was just sort of the globalist orientation. And so I remember my 8th grade junior high school yearbook, one of my friends wrote in, "I know you're going to get into Stanford in 4 years." And 4 years later, I got into Stanford, and I went to Stanford, and then I went to Stanford Law School. And you sort of had one competition after one sort of crazy competition after another. And I ended up, and then you sort of ended up at this law firm in Manhattan where you had all these people. It was, again, sort of just another wave of crazed competition to become a partner in the law firm. And it was sort of a very strange place where, from the outside, everybody wanted to get in. On the inside, everybody wanted to get out. And when I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said, I had no idea it was possible to escape from Alcatraz, which, of course, all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But psychologically, so much of what was valued was caught up in winning these competitions of one sort or another that one often lost sight of whether you were even working on things, how important the things were or anything like that. And in some ways, that sort of, and I had sort of this, rolling quarter-life crisis in my mid-20s where I came to rethink how much I'd been caught up in all these sort of hyper-competitive things, and even if you won the competitions, you might lose. You got into the right school, the right law school, the right law firm, and then why were you there? And it was just because you've been trying to beat people the whole time. And that's what I think. Is in some ways is my impression of New York City writ large. It's hyper-competitive. It's very good. But it's very good you get very good at the things you're competing on, but you may lose sight of whether the things you're competing on are the things that are truly important, whether they're the things that truly matter. And so when I think one way of describing this is you could say that globalization tells people the lie that they will get to rule the world. And so it's this really big place, and it's really exciting because you get to rule the world. You just have to go to New York, and from there you get to take over the world. And then once you get to New York, it turns out that a lot of other people have been told the exact same story, and so it's a lot tougher than it sounds. And so in my mind, there is something about globalization that is far more competitive than about technology, because globalization involves this copying, the sameness that sort of that escalates the competitive dynamics, whereas in an ideal world, technology would be very multidimensional. People would be working on very different things. You'd have the physicists working on string theory, and you'd have material scientists working on nanotechnology, and other people would be building quantum computers, and they could all succeed in their respective fields, and it would not actually be directly competitive in the way in which I think globalization is.
When I was a kid, I had a friend who had a car, and it was a convertible. It was actually a hardtop, but sort of in an accident, and it became a convertible. he also had a bumper sticker that read, abolish income taxes, and he had a chain and a master lock holding the hood down. It was a very dangerous car to be in. And we drive to Manhattan, and we'd park, this would be midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and we'd look at all the skyscrapers. Just look up and you'd be able to see all of them. And my favorite was the Empire State Building. The Art Deco, beautiful quality of it. But my admiration for it doubled when I discovered that it was built in 14 months. Now, it was built on the foundation of the Waldorf Astoria, which had been there, so maybe that saved a month or 6 weeks. Built the Empire State Building. The Golden Gate Bridge was built in a small period of time. You had mentioned nuclear weapons, which makes me think of the Manhattan Project. Think of the Apollo missions. There was a time in which America conceived of itself as capable of greatness, and really, in many respects, technological greatness. It feels as if we've been living in some depression or dream and not challenging ourselves to do great things, don't think of ourselves. And so we do well in the bits, but in the atoms and doing something extraordinary, it seems so inconceivable. We don't even know where to go. So,
Yes, I agree with that. This is a very multidimensional problem because if you ask why has there been this sort of slowdown in technology outside of IT, I always think that's a very hard question. Any question that starts with the word why is always hard to answer because it's probably overdetermined. I think there's certainly one kind of a, certainly there are some people who say everything's great. So that's the Silicon Valley answer, by the way. I should be very clear, my answer is not the typical Silicon Valley answer. The typical Silicon Valley answer is that everything's great, all you need is computers, you don't need progress in any other field. And we have tons of progress in computers, and that's all you need. So that's the Silicon Valley answer. Now, if you concede that it would be nice to have progress in some of these other areas, in medicine or in engineering, in various infrastructure projects and all these kinds of other things, then you end up with this question, why has it slowed down? And I think one sort of a division you can have is what you can sort of think of as a nature versus nurture or culture kind of a split. And so the nature arguments are basically, we've just run out of ideas. The easy inventions were discovered in the 19th and 20th century. That it was sort of this low-hanging fruit. It was picked, and now it's much harder to discover anything new. And that nature has just run out of easy inventions. And then I think the other sort of explanation is sort of more of a cultural one, that our culture has changed, where we're less ambitious, and it would say there was never low-hanging fruit. It was always hard to get to, and we're just not reaching quite as hard to get to it. I probably have a slight preference for the cultural explanations because I think the nature ones are always so lazy. And it's sort of like an excuse that people have for, it's an easy excuse. And I think we should ask whether there's something where culturally we don't focus on these things as much. And, and there also, and again, that maybe all sorts of different cultural factors. Maybe that our society's become too risk averse, or it's become too regulated, or it's possible that our education system isn't encouraging people to go into some of these fields, or that these fields aren't being rewarded in other ways. So I think it's, again, the cultural thing may be very, very overdetermined.
This is, I think, maybe a simple question and therefore immensely difficult. Why is innovation so important? Why not just say, we have whatever it is we have, we seem to get by well enough, we invite you here, you come, people come, that's pretty good. Why does America, why does the world need more innovation, especially technological innovation? What happens if we don't innovate anymore?
Well, let's see. Let me give sort of a. I would find it quite disappointing if we were done. I think there are all sorts of things where it's appalling that we're not innovating. 1 out of 3 people at age 85 is suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, and in the early 1970s, Nixon declared war on cancer. We had to do something about cancer. It's had limited success, that war on cancer, but it would be almost inconceivable today to declare war on Alzheimer's. It's just as bad as cancer. Maybe it's even worse. And we are so complacent that we're not even trying to do something about that. There is, certainly one of the great aspirations of the whole Enlightenment project more generally was the indefinite prolongation of life, and people's lifespans did extend very dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries, and there's and now maybe we should be happy, and we shouldn't try to extend them any more today, but that does seem like a diminution of expectations. And then there are probably all sorts of areas where it would be good to get cleaner energies to work, or it would be good, where the world is not a great place. And so I think to say that we have everything we need is to describe a level of perfection to our world that I find sort of shockingly, I find it to be shockingly imperfect in that respect. So that's sort of my personal reaction. But the political point I think one can make is that the main way our economy grows is through innovation, through gains in productivity. And so if you have no innovation, you would have no growth. And I do not believe that our representative system of democracy works without growth. The way our government works is you have people sitting around a table, and everybody compromises, and there's more for you, and more for you, and more for you, and there's more for everybody.
You've never been at a dean's meeting. Maybe you have been at dean's meetings.
Well, it works when the pie is growing. When the pie is not growing, our system does not work. It becomes gridlocked. It becomes a zero-sum game in which there is a loser for every winner. And I think that in the 1930s, which was an era when the growth sort of flagged throughout the world, it turned out countries became fascist or communist, and representative democracy does not work without growth. And so I think, so even though I personally would like to see a lot more technological progress, I also think that I worry a great deal about what happens to the stresses on our politics if we don't have it.
I know you're a chess player, and you were a very accomplished chess player when you were younger. I used to play at the Manhattan Chess Club a long time ago. And I remember when there was this possibility that computers could play chess with human beings and maybe even beat a human being. Unimaginable to me that a chess player of the stature of Bobby Fischer could be beaten, but Kasparov, yes. So Deep Blue, well, if you watched at Reykjavik, Spassky and Fischer, what a force of nature. So Deep Blue beats Kasparov. And this is given, and there's this Asian game Go, and a computer has beaten one of the great players in the world. So this gives credence to the notion that one place in which technological advancement, whether it's bits or atoms, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, could be made is in artificial intelligence. But I don't see any great advancements being made, and I've never been sure whether what it is that allows us to think, the intuition that's required to make judgments, that really marks innovation and marks insight into the fabric of the world of nature, whether that could be mimicked by AI. But so where do we stand with respect to AI, and what's your sense of its future?
Well, it's certainly the buzzword of the day in Silicon Valley, and the DeepMind beating the Go program, or Deep Blue beating Kasparov in 1997. Were definitely these big milestones. And artificial intelligence, it's a little bit of a poorly defined term. So it can sort of mean the next generation of computing. It can mean the last generation of computing that humans will build, anything in between. So it sort of has a sort of very expansive definition. If you're talking about the next set of improvements in computers, that tends to focus people on economic questions. Are the computers going to replace some jobs, or will they free people up to do other kinds of things? And so, whereas if you focus on computers that are just smarter than humans in every way possible, I think that's much more of a political question. So it would be like aliens landing on this planet. And if aliens land on the planet, the first question wouldn't be, what are they going to do to the unemployment rate? The question would be, are they friendly or unfriendly? And while I don't expect aliens to land on this planet anytime soon, the strong AI proponents would say that we're going to get something like a new form of sentience or intelligence that would transform things. I find myself a little bit skeptical of the strong AI claims. And then the economic question that I always try to bring these things back to is, where does it actually get applied? And what would be the applications? And so how much would it actually add to productivity? Probably the biggest application that people reflectively go to are self-driving cars, which would be a significant innovation. And they would change things. They would change things quite a bit. I would argue that a self-driving car is not quite as big as going from a horse to a car. So I would say horse to car was bigger than car to self-driving car. But I think that would be a sort of a moderate-sized innovation. And then there are questions about just how close that is. But if that's the biggest one that we normally hear of in the AI context, that's still, in my book, not going to be that big. It's not going to dramatically change living standards 10, 20 years down the line, and certainly not at the rate we should be progressing as a society.
Right. I don't like the idea of self-driving cars. I like cutting people off. I like driving fast, and you can't do that with self-driving cars.
Yeah, well, the pro-technology argument is always that you have no idea how bad things are right now. How many tens of thousands of people are being killed in car crashes every year, and how badly dysfunctional things actually are. And so that's always the trade-off. But yes, it would certainly be a big transformation.
Especially in California. When you were at Stanford, one of your professors, literary critic René Girard, who wrote a great deal on mimesis, on imitation, and we've talked about globalization involving at its core, its fundamental principle is copying, which is imitation. And just look at your jacket and look at mine. And Michael, Ali, although he has a tie on. I don't think I've ever seen our president in a tie. We're imitative beings.
Yes.
And this seemed, I have two children, and a friend who was in sociology, Edward Chills, told me it doesn't matter what you say to them. It doesn't matter. Don't worry about answering their questions. They'll see you every single day, and they'll learn to imitate you. So if you want them to become certain kinds of beings, that's how it will show up. We want our children to grow up and to imitate us in certain respects. Our clothes, we're imitative. We're conventional beings to the core. This seems to be a necessity of life. On the other hand, if I understand part of what you're saying, it turns out to be a curse. It's anti-innovation. So how do you balance, all right? Is this institutional balance? Is it personal balance? Is it educational balance? Do we learn in universities and elsewhere the importance of imitating in certain respects, but nevertheless being ambitious and taking risks and chances on one's own?
Yes. Let's see. Well, so I think that this idea goes back, the way I always like to describe that, already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. So there's something very deep in human nature about imitation. And of course, I would say we differ from the other primates in that we have a greater ability to imitate. It's how language gets learned when you're a kid. It's how culture gets transmitted. And it's how, it's certainly our educational system is, a lot of it is about imitating certain forms of learning and memorizing things that have been learned before and so on. And so I do think that without mimesis, without imitation, there'd be no civilization at all. So it's very, it's on one sense, it's very important. And then I do think there are these subtle places where it can go very wrong, where you can simply be focused on imitating things and you lose sight of what's valuable. This is what happens when you have financial market bubbles, where you have speculative manias, you have sort of the madness of crowds, and it becomes important to try not to do this and to have some innovation, individuality, creativity of one sort or another. The way I've often described this in Silicon Valley is that there's sort of this very strange phenomenon where many of the great entrepreneurs in these companies seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's or something like this. And I think we should always turn this into a critique of our society, where what sort of a society is it where having Asperger's is an advantage? And if you don't have Asperger's, you are at a disadvantage in our society because you are going to too quickly copy what everybody else is doing and too quickly get caught up in super competitive things like becoming a lawyer and going to work in a big law firm in Manhattan, or you start a business, you start a restaurant, you start a business like everyone else is starting. It ends up being a super competitive kind of a business. And I've often thought of the anti-Asperger's cohort in the US are students who go to business schools. So they are people who are super imitative, they have no convictions whatsoever, and they're very gregarious people. So they're socially very extroverted, they talk to all the people around them. And you can think of a business school as a hothouse environment where for 2 years you put people who have no ideas whatsoever what to do, but are really good at talking to one another about what they're doing. And they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest cohort every year does precisely the wrong thing. So, and it's because you can sort of see what the process is. You spend 2 years, you're talking to one another to try to figure out what to do next with your life. And then at the end of 2 years, everybody tries to catch the last wave, even though it's sort of not the right thing to be doing anymore. And so in 1989, they all wanted to work for Michael Milken. This was a year or two before he went to jail for all the junk bonds. And they were never interested in Silicon Valley except in 99, 2000, when all the people from Harvard Business School descended on Silicon Valley and timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly. And so there is something about it that goes very wrong. I tend to think that it's always somewhat healthy to have some kind of transcendental reference point, to have things that you really care about, that you're really interested in, and that the risk in looking to other people is that even though it always seems to be a shortcut, copying other people, learning from other people, it's a very powerful shortcut, but then it can go dangerously wrong because when everybody's copying everybody else, then we end up in some sort of crazy reality TV show or something like that.
Right. So we often talk about being passionate about something as essential to success. With your remark about people with slight cases of Asperger's being successful, I wonder if it's not being passionate, but being obsessed. Having one's mind so fixed on something, everything else.
I dislike those words quite a bit.
Good.
There's sort of an interesting historical factoid. It was in Nazi Germany that the favorite term praise for someone was that they were a fanatical worker. And it was because you were sort of so irrational, you didn't care, and you were sort of fanatical about your work. And there's something about passionate, obsession, fanatical things that has this sort of very anti-rational perspective. So I'd much rather have people who think about things, and who think about things independently, and who are reasonable, rational, not obsessed, not fanatical. Those don't seem to be desirable traits.
It's so clear how enthusiastic you are about ideas. I mean, it just shows on your face as we're speaking. What is the intellectual pleasure you get from your investment activities, your business activities? I mean, that must give you not just money, which is great, but intellectual satisfaction.
Well, you get to, in the Silicon Valley context where I work, you get exposure to, tremendous, interesting ideas people are working on. And there is something about starting a business where it's very interdisciplinary. And it's a very different kind of intellectual activity from what I tend to think is typical of an academic setting. An academic setting, you specialize, you have to focus extremely much. If you're an entrepreneur, what you're really doing is somewhat interdisciplinary. And the great entrepreneurs, when you speak to them, are able to speak about a lot of different kinds of things. If you talk to Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, he could talk to you about the product, he could talk to you about details of managing people, but then he'd also have some very strong views about how the world is going to change, how Facebook has to keep working to get into China because you can't have a social network in which nobody in China is on it. And then ideas about AI and where computers are going. And so it's sort of this whole range from the micro to the macro, and this very interdisciplinary kind of intellectual thing. So I would be very unsuited to being an academic because I'm interested in too many things, in a way.
Right. Let me shift gears ever so slightly. This seems to be the age of big data, or whatever it is you'd like to call it. And this movement has started showing up in medicine, in particular primary care medicine. So you have a physician who might see 10 children or 10 adults at most a day, maybe 10 in 2 days, where you have millions of cases across the whole United States that are now, because of all sorts of federal and state regulations, now there's requirement for all of this data to be digitized and then accumulated. And what results through, I suppose, pretty fancy algorithms is there are all of these ways of coming up with a diagnosis through big data and coming up with a recommended intervention on the basis of big data, coming up with a prognosis on the basis of big data. And it looks as if there are some pretty heavy, both epistemological questions about knowledge commitments and metaphysical questions about cause and effect, because all this big data is correlative. It has nothing to do with cause and effect. And it looks as if it's implying that the intuitive judgment of the physician who's there on the spot, making the local decision, is being set aside maybe for risk-averse purposes, insurance purposes. So all of this accumulation of data for medicine or other human domains, good thing, bad thing, problematic, leading us astray?
This is let me sort of answer this a little bit indirectly.
Sure.
People always ask me, what do I see as trends in technology?
Yeah.
And I always am very uncomfortable answering this question because I think the trends are always things that lots of people are already following. It's somehow the herd mentality.
After the fact.
And it's always after the fact. And so whenever you hear about a trend, it somehow is crowded and it's poorly defined the real innovation. And so the buzzwords you should always be skeptical of, and buzzwords like educational software, healthcare IT software, SaaS software, big data, cloud computing. When you hear these words, you need to almost think fraud
Run
and
for
run
the
away
exits.
as fast as you can. Now it is of course possible there are versions of this that will powerfully work but that's sort of my intuitive reactions. These are sort of these buzzwords, and then if we try to disentangle what's actually going on and why there are challenges, I would put it more on that I think the big data is it's a pure IT solution, and what we actually want in healthcare are biological interventions. Yeah. So the big data, we look at your genome, and we might conclude that you have the ApoE4 gene, which means you have 4 times the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's or dementia. Mm-hmm. So, but what we actually really, maybe there's a little bit of value in that. Maybe it'll affect how you plan your will or something like that. But what we actually want is a cure for dementia or Alzheimer's, and that's something that's more on the level of atoms, on actual interventions. And so, so my worry is that the focus on bits ends up distracting us from trying to find actual cures for these kinds of things. With respect to the doctors and computers working together, ideally they're complementary. So ideally, doctors use their intuitions. Computers might help them double check things. There's certainly some. I do think doctors are pretty bad at diagnosing things. They tend to be very bad at Bayesian probabilities, and so a lot of stuff does get misdiagnosed pretty badly. On the other hand, if a doctor just becomes sort of an appendage to this machine and stops thinking altogether, that might be an unhealthy development too. And so, the way one of my friends, I think there was a B.F. Skinner line. I'm not a big fan of his. It was the question is not whether machines can think, but whether humans will. And I think we should always be trying to build towards a world in which humans are encouraged to think more for themselves.
That's what we try to do every single day at Roosevelt University. Send your children here. So the name of our conference is The American Dream Reconsidered. America is surely, in some respects, a unique country. It's founded on a series of ideas about enlightenment. And if you step outside the doors of our university, inscribed across the doors is the enlightenment of the human spirit and how important this is. There have been more than bumps along the way having to do with indigenous peoples and having to do with slavery. Yet there are these principles that seem to be working their way out through America, principles of liberty, equality, the pursuit of happiness, a sense of the worth of the human individual, some Hegelian idea of the importance of the self-recognition of every single human being, which I suppose is behind the no child left behind notion, that everyone counts. So I have 2 questions about this. Does it make sense to talk about the American dream in a globalized world? Or did it only make sense in 1931 when, whatever the status of globalization, we were surely less globalized, less communication, less interaction among people all over the world? And secondly, connected to the notion of an American dream, there's no Wizarko, there's no Bulgarian dream that I know of, or Nigeria, Canadian, no, there's an American dream. This notion of American exceptionalism. Does it still make sense to talk about an American dream, whatever its substance, because of the advent of globalization? And is there something about America that makes this unique, singular notion of a dream, right, that makes us distinct, a plausible notion?
This is, again, so many different threads in that question.
Well, we're reaching the end, so I'm looking at it.
Let me try to disentangle that a little bit. So, I certainly think it's a good question for us to be asking, because most of us live in America, and there is a question how well our society is progressing towards the future. However you define progress, I define it in terms of mainly scientific and technological innovation, but you can certainly look at it in all sorts of other dimensions. And so I think it's always an important question for us to be asking how healthy it is, I would say historically, this was a frontier country. It was a country where people did new things. And so is it still possible for people to do new things in America? So the American dream, and American exceptionalism has a lot to do with the sort of notion of the frontier country, where our comparative advantage as a country was that we were a place where people were able to do new things. But I think exceptionalism is always a little bit two-edged, because on the one hand, it can be a very positive aspiration, where we are, we're the exceptional country where, in fact, there's more opportunity and more freedom to do new things. And then it can very easily flip into something where it becomes, we're exceptional, so we don't actually need to do anything. And so people in the United States are exceptionally overweight, for example, or they're exceptionally
interested in football.
They're exceptionally convinced that they're exceptional, which may in some cases make them exceptionally unexceptional. If you substitute the word self-esteem for exceptionalism, and you say that you think that you're great, that can be a very ambiguous thing. There's a point where thinking that you're great is a motivator to work even harder, and then there's a point where it can become an excuse for not trying. So it's a very subtle thing where it can tilt one way or the other.
So this is some version of the divide between optimism and pessimism.
Yes, I'm always skeptical of extreme optimism and extreme pessimism. So extreme optimism, extreme exceptionalism, if you will, tells you that the future is going to be so great, it will take place on its own. It's like this movie, the singularity is near. It's like you just need to sit back, eat some popcorn, and watch the movie of the future unfold. Everything's going to be awesome. Extreme pessimism, everything's going to be terrible. There's nothing you can do about it. And we think of extreme optimism and extreme pessimism as opposite extremes. But I think they're actually really similar, because extreme optimism tells you there's no need to do anything. Extreme pessimism tells you there's no point in doing anything. And so they both sort of converge on reinforcing laziness and not doing anything. And so I find sort of a much healthier attitude to be maybe moderate optimism, moderate pessimism, because that's where individual agency has a much bigger role to play. And so I would always try to steer that sort of a middle course. I'm a little bit pessimistic, but that's a good corrective in Silicon Valley, where people are extremely optimistic. And then there are other contexts in the US where I think people at this point are probably way too pessimistic.
All right. So that mongrelized question was going to be my last one, but let me ask one more, just on the basis of what you said. Besides being co-founder of PayPal and Palantir Technology with proper props to Lord of the Rings, you also have the Thiel Foundation that has these three elements to it. And one of the elements is the Thiel Fellowships, in which you get like 30 awards a year.
20 a year, yeah.
20 a year. 2-year award for people to do great research. I'm assuming that part of this is your dismay about the current state of American universities, that there's a kind of creativity or innovation that's either not sufficiently nourished or not sustained or even damped down in American universities. And since I'm a university professor, I have tenure, so I could say what I want, but nevertheless, I think universities and what we do for our students is just amazing things. But you have a jaundiced view of American universities. So tell us why.
Well, it's always I certainly think that we are in something of an educational bubble. Is the way I always like to describe it. We've been in an age of bubbles in all sorts of areas, and I think there's also a bubble in education, and it's manifested by the ever-rising tuition costs on universities. So the question of what universities are doing is a very different question at a certain tuition level. And if the tuition is 4 times as much, which is roughly what they've risen since 1980, adjusted for inflation, you'd end up with a very different set of questions. We now have $1.3 trillion of student debt. It was only $300 billion in 2000. It's gone up by something like a factor of 4 in nominal dollars in 15 years. And so I think at that level we have to ask far more critical questions about, is the education worth the debt that people are assuming? And it's a very pernicious form of debt because under President Bush 43, they rewrote the bankruptcy laws so you can never get out of student debt even if you go personally bankrupt. And you pay off your student debt for the rest of your life. And if you haven't paid it off by the time you're 65, they garnish your Social Security to pay off your student loans. And so I think it's sort of incumbent on us to ask some very tough questions about how well education is actually working, because it has taken on these very different roles, and because of the enormous costs that are being attached to it. The economic sort of description of it is often, what kind of a good is education? Is it an investment? So you're going to college as an investment into a future? Or is it a consumption good, where it's like a 4-year party? And these are two very different kinds of things. And often, when I started my critique of colleges, I thought it was sort of a weird superposition of an investment good and a consumption good, which is why people were confused. So they thought they were investing, but they were really consuming. But I've now come to think that it's actually a combination of two things that are much crazier than those two even. It's, on the one hand, it's the main reason people go to college is actually as an insurance product, where people go to college because they're scared of falling through the very big cracks in our society. And so even if it's not a great investment, it's still important to buy insurance. This is why parents save up so much money to send their kids to college, and then why the kids take out so much in student debt. And so I think we should, and whenever people are spending this much on insurance, I think we should be asking the underlying question, why have the cracks in our society gotten so big that people are spending more and more on insurance? And that would be a good question for us to ask. And then in some ways it gets obscured by the education piece. So on the one hand, it's an insurance product. Right. But then on the other hand, it's on some level, it's a tournament where, which is the exact opposite of an insurance, where especially the sort of elite universities are driven by exclusion. And the sort of the thought experiment I give is, if you were the president of Harvard or Stanford or any of these places, if you wanted to get lynched by a mob of students, faculty, and alumni, what you should do is you should give a speech saying that because you're such a great college and you're educating people so well, you're going to triple enrollment. And it's because the value of the elite universities comes from excluding people. What they really are is it's like a Studio 54 nightclub, where you want there to be an enormous line of people outside and you don't want to let anybody in. And that's what a tournament looks like. And that's very different from an insurance policy. And so when you conflate a tournament with an insurance policy and superpose those two, I think you end up with some really wacky decisions.
Speaking of questions, I think we have questions. Many questions. A few, but I still have more questions. Okay, so, what have you read lately? What, that you could tell us? I don't mean what have you read lately? What do you recommend?
Wow, I feel I always don't read quite enough, actually, but I taught a class at Stanford once. So there's sort of a category of books that I always like to recommend are past books that were written about the future. And I sort of organized it around teaching all these books from the past that were about the future. And then the question was, why did the future not turn out the way people envisioned it? on today's topic, two that I think are really interesting were the technology book was written by Zervan Schreiber, The American Challenge, 1967. Right. And it was about how we were in a technologically accelerating civilization. And it argued that America was going to sort of accelerate faster and faster. And so by the year 2000, it would have left the rest of the world in the dust. Mm-hmm. And therefore the average work week in the US would go down and down. So people were working, they were going to be working 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, mm-hmm. and have 13 weeks a year of paid vacation by the year 2000 because we were technologically accelerating. So it's a book where all the predictions were spectacularly incorrect, but it sort of reflects how we haven't actually accelerated technologically in the way that it was envisioned in the late 60s. And then that's sort of the technology one. And then the one that I think is always a somewhat disturbing one to look at is the Norman Angell book from 1911, The Great Illusion, which was an international bestseller in 1911. And the Great Illusion was that there could be a world war. And Norman Angell said this was just totally ridiculous. There could never be a world war because the world was globalizing. And it was so connected through finance and trade and all these kinds of things that a world war would make no sense because everybody would lose. And if you look at the American Challenge, it's completely dated, it's somehow completely off. If you look at this book from 1911, it sounds like it could be written today. And it's the exact same kinds of things people are saying, and then it does make one wonder and worry a little bit about whether we have some blind spots similar to the ones Norman Angell had at the time.
Right. One of my colleagues asked me before we had come in, she wanted to know what your first computer was.
It was a TRS-80.
What year was this?
This was 1979, 1980.
Huh.
I couldn't convince my parents to buy an Apple II. It's slightly cheaper than the Apple II.
Do you use Apple?
I use. I actually use just sort of the Microsoft, the standard Dell type computers.
Okay, but you have I just noticed you have an Apple phone.
Yeah, I use an Apple iPhone. Yes.
Okay, so that's still okay.
That is presumably okay. Yes.
Okay, good. I feel very comfortable. Good. You said first-rate people go to New York or Silicon Valley. Who comes to Chicago?
I didn't say that. So that's
Just reading.
You have to be very careful about.
Okay, good.
But I just said that you can think of New York and Silicon Valley as extreme versions of this sort of globalization and technology axis that we defined. I certainly think there is this, there is this very, one of the things we underestimate in our society politically is the importance of cities. Because if you think about the US Constitution, it was written at a time when there were no big cities, there were states, it was the federal government, and so all the way we talk about things, the way you learn about civics in high school is always about states and the federal government and the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. But I tend to think that the most natural political entity is actually a city. Mm-hmm. And cities have powerful network effects, and it's always a very important question to ask, what the comparative advantages, disadvantages various cities have, how you get them to work better. And so I think I don't have an answer to what exactly Chicago should be doing right now, but I think it may be an extremely important question, and it's the kind of question that I think we don't ask enough of.
I saw a chart recently. There are 3,100 some odd counties in the United States. More than half the population lives in 151 of these counties.
Well, if you look at if you look at the history of the world, most cities that have ever been started still exist. So a city in a way is close to an immortal being. It's You can occasionally kill a city. Carthage got destroyed. Conventional nuclear bombs, not enough to destroy a city. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they still exist. So cities have these incredibly powerful network effects. They're probably far more robust than countries. And
Why?
well, I think you have extraordinarily powerful network effects in cities, which don't quite work on the level of a country, and so there's a way that if cities are misgoverned, they can continue to be misgoverned very badly. I live in San Francisco, which has insane network effects and incredibly poor government, but it simply continues to boom. Whereas if something like on the level of the United States or California, if these entities don't work, there's a point where those are much more vulnerable than the cities.
Right. There's this old New Yorker magazine map. What, 3/4 is New York City.
Yes. Yes.
The rest of it is the rest of the United States. We have a question about universities. How do you see the roles of brick and mortar universities changing or changed some point into the future, 2025, 2050? Will President-elect today be president of a brick and mortar university, or is everything going to be online?
It's I don't think people are. Well, I do think there's this very tricky set of questions along the lines I articulated of how do we make it about, are people getting their money's worth in the tuition? How do you make it not the sort of weird dysfunctional tournament insurance policy that we have right now? And I tend to think that the shift to online universities has been somewhat overstated, and it's overstated because it doesn't actually go to a tournament. And so if so much about universities is about the status of getting a degree rather than the learning behind that, then if you could learn the same material online but you did not get the status from that, then that would it wouldn't be that valuable. But it's possible that that's going to shift, and that's the question. That's the question.
But given your experience at Stanford and Girard and other influential teachers you must have had, do you think that online learning can approximate kind of community that a classroom represents and the interaction? And
it's I suspect it won't quite approximate that, but I think there is a set of very difficult questions about how are the universities simply delivering enough for their students today? And so if you run up $100,000, $200,000 in student debt, there's a lot to be said for learning for its own sake.
Right.
But if you're amassing this large an amount of debt, are people really getting something out of it? And I think we're going to be asking more and more critical questions in that direction. So I think the universities sort of have a challenge that's independent of whether or not online education succeeds or not, and they should focus on somehow. And I think it's a very tricky question. Why have the costs escalated as much as they have?
I was just going to ask, do you have a considered judgment about this?
I think one sort of partial cop-out answer is they've gone up because they could. So it's people are so desperate to go to college that it was possible to charge more and more.
So elastic.
And the market was the demand was so inelastic in a way that you could charge more and more. But I think at some point you get to some breaking point, and it may be that we're at a breaking point with the higher education system. We're maybe close to a breaking point with the healthcare system, and if you have pharmaceuticals charging insane amounts for drugs, there's some point where that just is not going to be tolerated anymore.
All right. With an eye on the books that you had recommended, the Norman Angell book, and other books of that genre, Robert Nozick, who's professor of philosophy at Harvard, wrote a book in 1974, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, a response to John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice. And one of the things that Nozick does is he postulates an experience machine, a machine that is made by super-duper neurophysiologists, psychologists, and we could add to that now, the best AI people in the world. And you, Peter Thiel, could plug into this. And you could have whatever pleasures you'd want in life, whatever experiences as a virtual reality. And if you were worried that there wouldn't be failure, we could build in failure, and then you'd succeed. Would you plug in and spend the rest of your life on this machine? And we feel just like, this is such a nice room, it could never...
It would never be like this room.
Never be like this room. But otherwise...
No, I don't think I would, but I think the naive intuition is that the actual world is somehow more foundational than any simulated world. There's a version of this that's often a critique of the internet, that it's sort of replacing fake relationships with real ones, and I think that's always very misguided. So I started PayPal, and it wasn't trying to create some fake alternate currency on the internet. We try to use real dollars on the internet. Or Facebook, if you think about it, the critique of Facebook is it somehow is replacing fake relationships in cyberspace with real ones. It's letting fake relationships destroy the real ones you'd have in the actual world. And what I think was actually the powerful genius behind it was that it was a representation of real identity on the internet. And all the other attempts people had done were too fake. They were too virtual. One of my friends started a company in 1997 called SocialNet, and it was going to be, they had the idea of social networking 7 years before Facebook, and it was in the name of the company, and it was
not a good name.
It was not a bad name. I mean, not a bad name in a way, but it was all networking the abstract. And people would have these avatars, and you might be a virtual cat, and I'd be a virtual dog, and we'd figure out ways that we'd interact as virtual cats and dogs. And it turns out that's not what people are actually interested in. They're interested in real identity, in reality, and the really successful. The really successful internet businesses were ones that actually made cyberspace relatively real, not ones that created a totally disconnected alternate universe, a second life, or some alternate parallel universe. And I think something like that will be true of virtual reality, augmented reality, all these kinds of technologies. They will probably be most powerful to the extent that they're complements to the real world. So if you could have a conference call and you could see people halfway around the planet, and you could see them as though they were just there. That's the kind of thing that makes it more real. And then the ones where it's just this escapist fantasy, I think, will be much less important.
So one thing you can't do on such a machine is fail. Truly fail. You've had many successes. You've had many failures, I assume, and some important failures. Have they been important?
But I question that premise. I think.
Okay, good.
I would think on that machine you could never really succeed either.
Good.
I mean, because you snuck in the adverb "really."
I did. Yeah, no.
And so.
Good.
And so, I tend to think that there is just a shift a little bit in concluding. I don't think failure is something that's intrinsically worthwhile. I think it's, and in Silicon Valley, there's often almost this pornography of failure. People say, I failed at this and I failed at that, and that's how I learned and became better. And I think failure is something that you want to try to avoid in most cases, because it's quite destructive. It's psychologically very demotivating. You know, you want to be resilient so that, you know, when you fail, when there are setbacks, you sort of are able to move forward and keep going. But I don't think failure is intrinsically a good thing.
This conversation has not been a failure. Please join me in thanking Peter Thiel.